In the heart of West Africa, where the ancient kingdoms of the Mossi people once flourished, a 37-year-old captain is orchestrating what may be the most significant sovereignty movement of our generation. Ibrahim Traore's ascension to power in Burkina Faso represents far more than a military transition. It embodies the crystallization of decades of African frustration with neocolonial arrangements that have systematically impoverished the continent while enriching foreign powers. To understand the magnitude of what's happening in Ouagadougou today, we must first acknowledge the sophisticated geopolitical chess game that has defined Franco-African relations since the so-called independence era. The CFA franc, that ingenious monetary mechanism that ensures 14 African nations remain economically tethered to France, has functioned as a modern iteration of colonial extraction for over 6 decades. When Traoré challenges this system, he's not merely questioning currency arrangements, he's confronting the entire architecture of post-colonial dependency. Consider the audacity of France's continued presence in African affairs. Through Operation Barkhane, French forces have maintained military bases across the Sahel, ostensibly to combat terrorism, yet these same regions have witnessed escalating insecurity under their watch. The correlation is not coincidental. When external forces control security narratives, they simultaneously control resource allocation, governance structures, and ultimately, the trajectory of national development. Traoré's decision to expel French forces represents a sophisticated understanding of this dynamic, a recognition that genuine security cannot be outsourced to those who profit from instability. The young captain's background illuminates why his approach differs so markedly from the usual political elite. Educated in geology and trained in military strategy, Traoré brings a scientist's analytical rigor to governance. As the second youngest head of state globally, his generation witnessed the failures of structural adjustment programs, the devastation of neoliberal economic policies, and the hollowing out of African institutions under the guise of good governance initiatives. They understand that the vocabulary of development cooperation often masks relationships of domination. What sets Traoré apart is his ability to articulate a vision that transcends Burkina Faso's borders. When he speaks of African dignity, he's invoking a philosophical tradition that stretches from Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana to Thomas Sankara's revolutionary Burkina Faso. This isn't nostalgia, it's strategic positioning. Traoré understands that in a multipolar world, Africa's 1.4 billion people and vast natural resources represent a decisive factor in global power dynamics. His partnerships with Russia, China, and Turkey reflect a pragmatic recognition that diversifying international relationships dilutes the coercive power of any single external actor. The economic transformation underway in Burkina Faso deserves particular scrutiny. Traoré's administration has prioritized food sovereignty, industrial development, and resource beneficiation, policies that directly challenge the colonial economic model that relegated African nations to raw material exporters. When Burkina Faso begins processing its own gold, cotton, and agricultural products, it's not merely adding value to commodities, it's restructuring the entire basis of its international economic relationships. This represents sophisticated economic nationalism, the kind that built industrial powers throughout history. The regional implications of Traoré's leadership extend far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The emergence of the alliance of Sahel states linking Burkina Faso with Mali and Niger signals a coordinated effort to reshape West African geopolitics. These nations, all led by young military officers who've rejected French influence, are pioneering a new model of African integration, one based on shared sovereignty rather than external dependency. Their collective withdrawal from ECOWAS, the economic community of West African states, reflects a calculated decision to prioritize authentic African unity over institutions that serve as proxies for Western interests. The generational dimension of this transformation cannot be understated. Traoré represents a cohort of African leaders who came of age during the internet era, with access to global information networks that previous generations lacked. They've witnessed China's remarkable development trajectory, observed how nations like Singapore and South Korea leveraged state-directed capitalism to achieve rapid industrialization, and studied the strategies employed by successful developing nations. This intellectual sophistication informs their rejection of the Washington Consensus orthodoxy that has dominated African economic policy for decades. The response from Western media and policy establishments has been predictably hostile. When African leaders challenge existing arrangements, they're invariably portrayed as threats to stability, democracy, or regional security. This narrative manipulation serves specific interests. It delegitimizes African agency while reinforcing the notion that external intervention remains necessary for African progress. Traoré's media strategy, including partnerships with alternative information platforms, represents a sophisticated understanding of how narrative control functions in contemporary geopolitics. The youth of Burkina Faso, like their counterparts across Africa, have embraced Traoré's vision with remarkable enthusiasm. They understand that their futures depend on breaking free from economic structures that guarantee poverty despite abundant natural resources. When they celebrate Traoré's leadership, they're not merely supporting an individual, they're endorsing a comprehensive reimagining of African possibility. Their agency in making these judgments reflects the democratic sensibilities that Western observers often claim to champion while simultaneously undermining. The agricultural revolution underway in Burkina Faso exemplifies the practical dimensions of this sovereignty movement. By prioritizing food security, supporting smallholder farmers, and investing in agricultural infrastructure, Traoré's administration is addressing the foundational requirements for genuine independence. Nations that cannot feed themselves remain vulnerable to external manipulation. The emphasis on agricultural development reflects a sophisticated understanding of how food systems intersect with national security. The continental implications of Traoré's leadership extend to the African Union and various regional bodies. His vocal advocacy for African solutions to African problems has energized constituencies across the continent who've grown weary of external mediation in African affairs. From Lagos to Nairobi, from Accra to Addis Ababa, African intellectuals, entrepreneurs, and activists are drawing inspiration from the Burkinabe example. This represents the emergence of a genuine Pan-African consciousness that transcends the symbolic gestures that have characterized much of post-colonial African diplomacy. The technological dimension of Burkina Faso's transformation deserves attention. Traoré's administration has prioritized digital infrastructure, understanding that technological sovereignty represents a crucial component of broader independence. When African nations control their own communications networks, financial systems, and information platforms, they reduce their vulnerability to external manipulation. The partnerships with non-Western technology providers reflect this strategic thinking. The mining sector reforms initiated under Traoré's leadership illustrate the economic nationalism that distinguishes his approach. By renegotiating contracts with multinational corporations and ensuring greater domestic beneficiation of mineral resources, Burkina Faso is reclaiming control over its economic destiny. This represents the kind of resource nationalism that successful developing nations have employed throughout history to finance their own development. The security transformation in Burkina Faso, while complex, reflects the limitations of externally directed counter-terrorism strategies. Under French military presence, insecurity actually escalated across the Sahel. Traoré's decision to expel foreign forces and develop indigenous security capabilities represents a long-term investment in genuine stability. When communities control their own security arrangements, they can address the root causes of conflict rather than merely managing symptoms. The ideological clarity of Traoré's vision distinguishes him from the technocratic approaches that have dominated African governance for decades. He understands that development is fundamentally political. that it requires dismantling structures of dependency and building institutions that serve African interests. This represents a return to the transformative politics that characterized the independence era while incorporating lessons learned from decades of neocolonial experience. The international partnerships that Traoré has cultivated reflect a sophisticated understanding of contemporary geopolitics. By diversifying Burkina Faso's relationships and refusing to remain trapped within francophone networks, he's creating space for independent decision-making. These partnerships are transactional rather than dependent. They're based on mutual benefit rather than historical obligation. The agricultural policies implemented under Traoré's leadership demonstrate the practical dimensions of food sovereignty. By supporting local farmers, investing in irrigation infrastructure, and promoting crop diversification, Burkina Faso is building the foundation for sustainable development. This represents the kind of strategic thinking that successful nations have employed to achieve food security while generating rural employment. The educational reforms initiated by Traoré's administration reflect an understanding that intellectual decolonization must accompany political independence. By promoting African languages, integrating African history into curricula, and investing in technical education, Burkina Faso is preparing its citizens for the challenges of the 21st century. This represents a comprehensive approach to human development that transcends the narrow focus on primary education that has characterized much international development assistance. Ibrahim Traoré's leadership represents more than a moment. It embodies a movement. Across Africa, from the townships of South Africa to the markets of Nigeria, from the universities of Ghana to the farming communities of Kenya, people are watching Burkina Faso with hope and anticipation. They understand that what happens in Ouagadougou will influence possibilities across the continent. This is why Traoré's success matters beyond Burkina Faso's borders. It demonstrates that genuine African sovereignty remains achievable. The vision that Traoré articulates of an Africa that controls its own resources, makes its own decisions, and charts its own course represents the fulfillment of promises made during the independence era. His leadership reminds us that African agency has always been the driving force behind progress on the continent. When African leaders serve African interests, transformation becomes inevitable. This is why your engagement with content like this matters. When you like this video, you're not just supporting a YouTube channel, you're amplifying African voices in global conversations. When you subscribe, you're helping to build alternative media networks that challenge dominant narratives about Africa. When you share this content, you're contributing to the circulation of ideas that can transform how the world understands African agency and possibility. The sovereignty movement that Traoré represents depends on information networks that operate outside of traditional gatekeepers. Your participation in building these networks, through likes, subscriptions, shares, and comments, represents a form of solidarity with African self-determination. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and ring the notification bell to ensure you don't miss our ongoing coverage of Africa's sovereignty movements. Share this video with others who believe in African agency and self-determination. Together, we're building the intellectual infrastructure that will support Africa's continued rise. The fate of Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré's leadership will influence possibilities across the continent. By supporting independent African voices and perspectives, you're contributing to a transformation that extends far beyond any single nation. This is how genuine change happens, through the circulation of ideas, the building of networks, and the amplification of authentic African voices. Subscribe, like, share, and join us in documenting Africa's ongoing renaissance.